Well, some wise person once said that there are only two things in life that are inevitable: death and taxes. A burglar needed some money to pay his income taxes, and so he decided to rob a store. Well, he went into the store and he found the safe. And on the safe door was a sign. And the sign said, "Please don't use dynamite. This safe is not locked. Just turn the handle." And that's just what he did. And when he turned the handle, a heavy sandbag fell on his head. The entire premises were flooded with light, and alarms started clanging. And as the police carried him out of the store on a stretcher, he was heard moaning, "My confidence in human nature has been rudely shaken." Some of us might feel like a sandbag has fallen on our heads after meeting our obligations to the government. Every year they have Tax Forgiveness Day, and it's actually somewhere in is it June or April? It's a long way into the year. And that's the day when we're actually working for ourselves. But up until that time, we're working to pay our taxes. We know that paying our taxes is a privilege. Living in this country is a privilege. Someone on a road sign in Oklahoma saw a sign demanding that we pay no taxes, and it was on a federally funded highway. There is no free lunch, according to economists, but some people still want the privilege of citizenship without its responsibilities. At least that pain is somewhat universal. According to an item in the Associated Press a while back, tax authorities in a city in southern India found a very unique way of handling tax evaders. And I've experienced this, but I didn't know that that was what they were doing. But when I lived there, they were doing this for something else. They send a team of drummers to the person's house, and they stand outside the house or the shop, and they noisily drum continually until the tax bill is paid. Tax officials in that city have been successful in recovering nearly $1 million owed. And other cities nearby are now asking if they can use the same method. It's been a great success. The people of Jesus felt the same way about the taxes that many of us do. But paying taxes was even more problematic for them. You see, for one thing, they had to use Roman currency to pay their taxes. And for them, that was a really big problem because Roman coins bore the graven image of Caesar. And you see, a devout Israelite would not even carry a Roman coin. They weren't even allowed to carry one because it was considered a violation of the commandment against graven images. The currency was just one of the problems. Even more of a problem was the tax system itself. According to the biblical scholar William Barclay, there was a tax that was payable for using the main roads. Okay, we have our throughway tax. We can all understand that. There was one for using the harbors. There was one for the markets. There was a tax payable on a cart, on each wheel of the cart, and on the animal which drew it. A tax collector could bid a person to stop wherever they were on the road, unpack their bundles, and charge them whatever they wanted. If a man couldn't pay, the tax collector would offer them money at a very high interest rate to get him further into the clutches. So the next time you have to pay your taxes, count your blessings. We complain about the IRS, but they're sweethearts compared to the tax collectors of Jesus' time. And that's why when we read the parables of Jesus, he talks about we hear a lot of talk about the tax collectors. They were not well-liked people for very good reasons. But still, taxes were a fact of life then, just as they are now. So the Pharisees tried to trap Jesus today in our scripture. They sent their disciples to him, and they tried to get him to say who the taxes should be paid to, but he tricked them. He had them look at the coin and he said, whose face is on this coin? And they said, Caesar's. And he said, well then give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but give to God what belongs to God. Supporting our government is a part of the responsibility that we all face as citizens, back then and even now. We may or may not agree with the way our government spends our money. That's our right, and it's one of our precious rights. Actually, it's a long-standing American tradition to make fun of government officials. John Adams actually once said, in my many years, I have come to the conclusion that one useless man is a shame, two useless men is a law firm, and three or more is Congress. And Mark Twain once said, suppose you were an idiot, and suppose you were a member of Congress, but then I repeat myself. We laugh because it's the only way we can deal with our frustrations sometimes. Our whole system is rigged to make it very difficult to remove an incumbent member of Congress, as we all know. But somehow our nation survived. And though we may grumble, most of us understand that we need to pay our taxes. We render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. We do so, happily or not, but we still have to do it. There was a man a few years ago who quite happily gave to his government, and I thought this was a fascinating story. A man named Stanley Newberg. And Stanley Newberg came to the United States as a small child, as an immigrant. He was from poor Austrian family, and he became quite wealthy. And at his death in 1986, his estate included $5.6 million in cash, which he bequeathed in its entirety to the United States government. In deep gratitude, quote, for the privilege of residing and living in this kind of government, notwithstanding, he wrote, many of its inequities. When the estate was settled, his $5.6 million went directly into the U.S. Treasury, where it lasted about a minute and a half. Talk about a drop in the bucket. Still, we're obligated to render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Rendering to God, on the other hand, is not an obligation that we think of. But for God, it's the most important obligation. Back in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, God tells us that we are to tithe 1/10 of all that we have, to give the finest and the first. So if you're picking your garden and you have one beautiful tomato, just so ripe and beautiful and deep red, and you know, you can almost taste I can taste it right now, what it's going to taste like. You know, you wait all year for that taste of those fresh tomatoes. And if you have another tomato that kind of got a little wormy, guess which one you're supposed to give to God? The beautiful one, not the other one. We're supposed to give to God. And I think sometimes we forget that time. We forget what we're supposed to do. Rendering unto God is entirely voluntary. We have to work hard just to get there. There's a story about a local fitness center who was offering $1,000 to anyone who could demonstrate that they were stronger than the owner of the fitness center. And it went like this. The owner, a real big muscle man who worked out all the time, probably took steroids too, would squeeze a lemon until all the juice ran out and there was not one drop left. And then he would challenge people, if you can get one more drop out of this lemon, you win the prize. And many, many, many people tried, and no one could do it. But one day, a short, skinny guy came into the gym, and he decided to give it a try, and everybody was laughing because they knew he wouldn't make it. The owner grabbed a lemon and squeezed away until there was nothing left, and then handed it to the young man. The crowd's laughter turned to silence as the man clenched his fist around that lemon and squeezed 6 more drops of juice out of that lemon. As the crowd cheered, the manager paid out the winning prize, and then he asked the skinny guy what he did for a living, and the man said, "Oh, I'm the treasurer of the Baptist church." Now some interesting statistics from George Barna, who's a great church statistician and keeps track of all things nationwide on churches. Of those adults who regularly attend church at least once a month, 37% did not give anything last year. He goes on to say that only 3 to 5% of the people who do give tithe their income, which is 10%. And the situation's getting worse. In spite of our increasing affluence, one study showed that U.S. Christians give proportionately less today than they did during the Great Depression. And if you think about that for a while, it'll make sense to you. Giving to Caesar is required by the state. Giving to God is voluntary. And that puts God at a disadvantage. However, having said that, I must tell you that there's a new trend developing. And it's called radical generosity. And we see it, and you've probably seen documentary shows on television about it, with the very wealthy like Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett, who are giving away millions of dollars to worthy causes every year. But it's also true of everyday people. And Bill Hybels tells the story about a woman named Bev. Now, Bev and her husband owned a nearby condo which they rented to their daughter. Well, one night some kids were throwing mud balls around, and one of them happened to hit the condo's window and broke it. The daughter got the name and the phone number of the young man who threw the ball, but when she finally reached his mother, it was apparent that the family didn't have available funds to cover the cost of the window. The mother, however, promised that she would send money as soon as she could, but with both she and her husband out of work, the likelihood of that happening was not great. And so, Bev and her husband paid to have the window repaired. Several months passed and Bev still hadn't heard from the woman, and so she decided to call her herself. It was a couple of days before Thanksgiving, she said, and she said she was preparing to go to the grocery store, and she couldn't figure out why she called the woman before she left, but she did. The woman answered the phone, and Bev knew what she was going to say, but as soon as she answered, she said, these words came out of my mouth. "I'm on my way to the grocery store, and I just wondered if I could bring you a Thanksgiving meal this year." She was shocked, she said, by her own spurt of compassion, but she went to the store, and she purchased 2 of everything that her family was going to have that day for dinner. And with a genuine sense of joy, she dropped off overflowing bags at this woman's house on her way back home. Can you imagine, Bill Hybels said, how deeply the unemployed mother must have been marked by the spontaneous gift of generosity from a woman that she'd never met and to whom she owed money. Now let me ask you a question. Who do you think had the better Thanksgiving that year? The woman who received the groceries or the woman who paid them? You know the answer to that question. This is a secret that only few people ever discover. It's truly more blessed to give than to receive. Radical generosity, it's the secret of a blessed life. And radical generosity is what it means to follow Jesus Christ. Jesus rendered all that he had to give to us. Everything he had to give to us. And that's why we worship him today. And that's what we seek radical generosity for in our lives. Because we want to be like Jesus. We want to imitate him. And we want to understand what living that way could mean for us. Reverend David Dykes told a wonderful story, and it's a true story, about what happened in the church that he once served. He was serving as a pastor in Alabama, and their church was in the middle of a huge stewardship campaign. They had some repairs they needed to do on their church, and they had some new mission that they wanted to do. So they were doing a huge campaign. And there was a lady named Nell in the church who was a widow, and her husband left her a lot of money, and she had a lot more than she ever needed. She loved the Lord and she loved her church, but she tended to be rather conservative. So the stewardship banquet happened one night, and when she received her pledge card, she filled it out and wrote down an amount that was safe. We all know what safe means. It was not an amount of radical generosity at all. And that evening, Reverend Dyke spoke on the passage in which Jesus says, "Don't store up your treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt, and thieves break in and steal, but lay up your treasures in heaven." And Dyke spoke about how moths eat up wool when we're wearing it, but not when we store it. They eat up wool when we store it, not when we're wearing it. Put that backwards. And he went into a whole bunch of great detail about moths. And then he spoke about how rust destroys tools that are just stored, but not when they're being used. And so his point was that when we store up God's resources, they don't accomplish anything. We have to use them, or they become moth-eaten and rust-encrusted. So the widow Nell went home after that banquet, feeling a little bit guilty about the amount she pledged, and given the amount that she had. She walked up to her front door, and when she opened a purse to get out a key, a remarkable thing happened, and she was totally shocked. Somehow a huge moth had gotten into her purse, and when she opened it, the moth flew out and flew away. Surprised beyond belief, she decided that God had used that moth to teach her a lesson. She didn't need to be storing up her money. She needed to be using it for God. So she returned to the church, and she got her pledge card back. She doubled her amount and marked it, and then she decided again and crossed it out and tripled her amount and gave it back to the pastor. Now, Reverend Dykes was heard to say, "Folks, I had a really hard time getting that moth into her purse." But then he said, "Seriously, I did not do it, and I don't know how it got there." But Nell says to this day, she knows how it got there, and she believes it was God. I love that story. I think it's a great story. There are many people who miss the joy of giving simply and solely because they're afraid. And so they save up for a rainy day that never comes. It's a shame that they can't trust God to provide for their daily bread. Because if they did, then they would discover the joy that radical generosity gives to a person. Are you one of those people? Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Not much choice there. But render unto God what belongs to God. That's where the joy lies. I hope you don't miss out on that joy. Amen.